My first experience with same-sex attraction happened when I was very young. I was probably 6 or 7 at the time. It started out as the typical experimentation that most young boys go through. But in my case, it quickly escalated to a little bit more than experimentation. It became more, at that age, I don't want to say obsession, but it was something that I sought out. Being that young and coming into that experience, I felt and I knew even then that there was something wrong with this. Couldn't exactly put my finger on it, but I knew something was wrong. When I was growing up, we were taught first to go to First Communion. We had our First Communion when we were 7 years old, which we were taught the doctrine of the church at that very age too. You then are taught what communion is and then what confession is. So that was an interesting experience for me because I understood what sin was at a very young age. I would honestly say that many times I went to bed trying to fall asleep, very much tormented by the thoughts and by how I felt. And I remember going to sleep, putting we used to get, everybody had either a cross as a on a chain, or you had a cross up in your room, and I had one of those crosses. I remember one night waking up in the middle of the night, having the cross, must have picked it up underneath my pillow, had it against my chest, and I woke up in a cold sweat, just feeling that torment. Wanting peace, not necessarily wanting what I was feeling and what I was going through, desiring, if I could call it freedom, but I didn't even know that was possible at the time. Being raised in the Catholic Church, you were taught about God at a very young age. God to me was distant. God to me was resident in the tabernacle of a church. God to me was very much a distant God. I hit puberty at 10 years old, which is kind of young, but for anybody with dark hair, Mediterranean background, you tend to hit it young, and it hit me young, and it just exacerbated that whole issue to the point where I thought, I've got to get some relief here. I've got to get some freedom. So I had this idea of going to confession at church. I was been going to confession for 3 years since I was 7 years old, but never knowing how do I confess this? What do I confess? Fearful of confessing it. But I thought, God, I need to say something. I need to be free. And I remember I went in ready, and I told the priest that I had impure thoughts about other boys. Then the hammer came down. I'm not sure he knew how to handle it. There was, I can remember a lot of yelling. I can remember being told I had a train ticket to hell. I remember going out and sitting in the pew, just kneeling there, thinking, what happened? I continued in that sin for several more years, always looking for a way out. I can remember Catholics, again, are taught that the presence of God is in the sanctuary of the church. And I can remember during the week I used to think, well, God must be lonely. So I would go to the church. And I can remember crawling up from the back of the church to the front of the church on my hands and knees, just looking for forgiveness, looking for some way of making amends for what I was doing and the way I was acting. This went on for several years. I came to an impasse. I realized that I could no longer go on like this. I felt like I was living in two worlds. And during college, I remember I got an audition sheet to try out for one of the local community theaters, and I've always been kind of interested in theaters. So I thought to myself, wow, I would love to get into community theater. I want to know if I could act or could really act. So I get into theater and I meet for the first time people that considered themselves homosexuals. I did not divulge my secret, but I kind of observed. I observed the lifestyle. I observed what was going on there, how they acted, what they were like. And it wasn't a very light place, let me put it that way. And there, in that dark place, is the first time I met anyone who could talk about Jesus as if they knew him, as if they were their best friend. And I could remember her talking to me. And as she would tell me about Jesus, I was very much a staunch Catholic, and I would talk about being Catholic. But she would come back with knowledge about Jesus, and like he's a friend, like he's someone that can come up alongside you. And I was intrigued, but wary. In my room, there was a picture of what we called the Sacred Heart. It was a profound picture of the face of Jesus as an artist could portray him, with an open heart, thorns all around it. But I remember taking that picture off the wall and just looking at it. Tears came to my eyes and said, Jesus, all I want to do is follow you. That was the moment of my salvation. That was the moment that things started to change. There was a change of perspective in me. I went back to my friend in the theater who was telling me about Jesus, and I told her what happened. And she looked at me and said, that's salvation. And I can remember for a moment feeling like, wow, I'm saved. That's it. Unfortunately, that moment lasted a moment, and then the war began. But I remember this, thinking, God, I want to be so free as if I wasn't growing, as if I never grew up that way. And that's what happened. It took a long time, but I never gave up. I would speak the truth over myself. I began to determine in my mind and in my heart there was freedom. Jesus, you said, this is your word. For whom the Son is set free is truly free indeed. So I'm just going to believe that. When I began to realize, that there's a way out of temptation that didn't have to lead to this sin, that was a big breakthrough, to understand that I wasn't the sum total of my temptations. No matter what I was tempted, whether it was a homosexual encounter or to lie about a homosexual encounter, no matter what the sin was, I didn't have to give in. And I can remember the days of my temptation was like, wrestling an alligator. But I believe, and what happened eventually, is that now temptation is, sorry, it's just not me anymore.